I saw the reflection of red and blue lights pirouetting across my living room walls, and my heart seized. It was after midnight, and there they were, the cops, creeping through my cul-de-sac. At first, I thought they made a wrong turn, or maybe one of my neighbors had called them for a rowdy party. My neighborhood was rarely the scene of anything so dramatic. But then a firm knock landed on my front door. My initial reaction was to check the locks and assume there'd been some awful mistake. I'm a father of one, a teenage boy named Marshall. He's not perfect. He's got that rebellious streak, but nothing that I thought warranted a late-night visit from the police. I flicked on the porch light, cracked open the door, and found two officers standing there. The younger officer had a polite face but seemed nervous. The older one wore the expression of someone who had spent years reading people like newspapers. Without so much as a greeting, the older officer said, "Mr. West, we have your son in custody." In custody for what? I demanded, confusion swirling inside me. My immediate thought was some petty teenage offense, maybe trespassing at the community pool after hours or ignoring curfew. I had no clue yet that this had something to do with a bubble foam fiasco. The older officer didn't shift an inch. For malicious property damage at the Heritage Oaks Homeowners Association headquarters. Heritage Oaks, that's our community, an HOA notorious for its iron-fisted approach to neighborhood governance. I'm used to them giving me notices about my trash cans or yard hedges being an inch too tall. I'd never heard of them pressing actual criminal charges against a resident, let alone a teenager. A strange combination of confusion and anger pressed down on me. "Did you say property damage?" He adjusted his radio. "Specifically, your son is accused of flooding their meeting room with foam, soap suds, apparently, and damaging electronic equipment in the process." I stood stunned, phone still in my hand. An hour earlier, I'd been half watching a rerun of a cooking show, ignoring my half-empty teacup and drifting off. Now I was dealing with a scenario so bizarre I could barely force my mind to accept it. Marshall had been arrested. For foam? I tried to get more details out of the officers, but they were short on specifics. Something about a complaint from the HOA's chairperson, a set of security cameras capturing glimpses of a hooded figure. The police claimed it was Marshall, and the entire meeting room carpet turning into a veritable ocean of bubbles. The older officer flipped through a small notepad, not quite sure how to phrase it. Apparently, the door was unlocked. They were prepping for some late event, and your son poured industrial-strength soap into the building's vents or air system. The security footage is grainy, but it's enough for the HOA to press charges. Marshall is 17, tall, skinny, prone to wearing the same black hoodie day in and day out. He's a typical teen in that sense, maybe with more than his share of mischief. But industrial-strength soap? Breaking into a building? It didn't sound like him. When I pressed the officers for their proof, they admitted it was the HOA that had insisted they make an arrest. They needed to question Marshall directly down at the station. That's how I found myself grabbing my car keys at 12:30 a.m., trailing a police cruiser to the local precinct. I'd never been inside the station's drab beige walls, except to renew my concealed carry permit years back. Walking in under these circumstances, with the overhead fluorescents buzzing and the stale coffee smell hitting me, felt surreal. We ended up in a hallway to fill out forms, an experience that was ironically more complicated than the time I closed on my mortgage. When they finally led me into a small, windowless room to see Marshall, my heart hurt. He sat hunched over a metal table, arms folded. He'd always been tall and lanky, but in that moment, he looked heartbreakingly small. The combination of relief and frustration tore at me. I was glad he was physically safe, but I was angry at the situation. I wanted to know what on earth had happened and why. The officer waiting with him, the younger one, looked fairly apologetic. He must have been new to the force. Marshall didn't meet my eyes right away. When I sat across from him, I had a million questions. Was this a prank gone too far? A dare? A misunderstanding? The first words out of Marshall's mouth were a soft, "Dad, I didn't do this." There was a resignation in his eyes, but also the glimmer of a teenage panic that assured me he was dead serious. He was scared, and at that moment I believed him. Because if there was one thing I've learned in my 45-plus years, it's that my kid, like most kids, will come clean when cornered. Yet, We had no time to talk privately. The older officer re-entered and began rattling off the litany of complaints: breaking and entering, property damage, potential for criminal trespass charges, reckless conduct. And that's when they dropped the big one. The HOA was pushing for a felony. They claimed the foam shorted out their computers, destroyed archival files, and caused thousands of dollars in repair costs. By the time they finished, my head was throbbing. I asked if we could bail Marshall out, which launched me into a bureaucratic ring of paperwork nightmares. There, under the harsh fluorescent lights, I realized something. The Heritage Oaks HOA meant business. They wanted a scapegoat. And I couldn't shake the feeling there was something deeper going on, some petty power struggle or bitter vendetta that had nothing to do with my teenage son. Because you don't ruin a kid's life over a bubble prank, no matter how ill-conceived. I signed the last of the paperwork with trembling hands, determined to unearth every detail of what had gone on in that stuffy meeting room, and exactly why the HOA was so eager to throw my boy under the bus. Early the next morning, after a scant 4 hours of sleep, I found myself pacing in my kitchen. Marshall was upstairs. Thankfully, I'd managed to get him released on bail. The HOA fiasco, however, was just beginning. A sense of dread lingered beneath my ribs, because once the HOA smelled blood, they rarely let go. My first brush with the Heritage Oaks HOA's fervor happened a decade ago, shortly after we moved in. They knocked on my door, explained that my mailbox was not in compliance with the neighborhood aesthetic. I was polite but confused. I was non-compliant about a regular black mailbox on a post. Apparently, the color black was not part of the community palette, which called for something closer to a soft midnight gray. I ended up painting it to avoid the daily nastygrams. That was how it all started. A dozen spats over fences, a few heated letters about trash complacement. I always paid the fines, shrugged, and tried to keep my head down. This, though, arresting a teenage boy, was leagued beyond nitpicking paint colors. I'd heard rumors at barbecues and block parties that the HOA board had become more militant over the years, especially after they elected Linda Fitzsimmons as chairperson. Linda the Terminator, some folks joked. She was known for her unwavering devotion to rules. She didn't just hand out warnings. She practically typed them in triplicate and delivered them via courier. I never had a direct showdown with Linda before, but from what I understood, she had an iron grip on the entire neighborhood. Despite my annoyance, I also knew I needed more than my instincts to clear Marshall's name. People were asking questions. Neighbors who typically only gave me a wave were suddenly offering sympathetic glances or awkward chatter about the trouble at the HOA building. The news spread faster than the foam had, evidently. I decided to do something I'd never done. Actually go inside that dreaded HOA headquarters during business hours and see the mess for myself. I set out around mid-morning. The building stood at the neighborhood's far end, a squat structure painted in muted beige tones, with a boxy design that reminded me more of a surplus government office than the communal heart of a suburban neighborhood. The sign out front read, Heritage Oaks Association, please wipe feet before entering. Even the sign had a bossy vibe. Inside, a starchy woman behind the reception desk nearly catapulted from her seat when I mentioned my name. Mr. West, we do not have an appointment scheduled for you, she said, making it sound like I trespassed into the White House. I tried to remain calm. I don't need an appointment. My son was charged with damage to this place last night, and I need to see what exactly he's supposed to have done. She pursed her lips. I'm not sure if that's allowable, sir. Allowable? My kid could be facing a felony because of bubble foam. My voice echoed around the sterile lobby. A pair of workers carrying a stack of new carpeting whizzed by, their faces flushed with sweat. They were clearly part of a cleanup or replacement crew. Before she could respond, a door behind her opened. Out walked Linda Fitzsimmons herself, short, wiry, sporting a fashionable gray bob and eyes that looked ready to burn holes through the walls if things were out of regulation. Her lips stretched into a thin-lipped smile that didn't touch her eyes. Mr. West, she said in that tone used by principals who call you into the office for a stern lecture, I thought I might see you. Linda, I nodded. I'm sure you know why I'm here. She folded her arms, inhaled, and exhaled pointedly. This is quite the unfortunate incident. Her voice had a measured calm that felt rehearsed. We have every reason to believe your son is responsible. Our cameras recorded a figure matching his height and clothing, and a suspicious car matching yours was seen pulling away from the parking lot. I bristled. My car? I was at home all night. She shrugged. Perhaps Marshall borrowed it. The police can confirm the timeline. Something about her posture, her unwavering composure, nagged at me. She was too ready for this confrontation. I glanced around the interior. The hallway carpets were rolled up, presumably destroyed by the suds. A pungent odor of cleaning supplies lingered in the air, as if they'd used a gallon of disinfectant to eradicate every last bubble. "I'd like to see the meeting room," I said. Linda's expression tightened. "The area is off limits at the moment. We're having everything replaced. The foam compromised the electronics. Thousands of dollars in damages." Her words had a crisp finality, and I couldn't ignore the way she tossed around that figure, as if brandishing a weapon. "Is that the reason you're pressing felony charges?" I tried to keep my voice steady. Anger flared in me at the thought that a community association could upend a teenager's life so easily. Her eyebrows rose. "If you're implying we have any choice, Mr. West, let me clarify. The board decided it was time to take a hard stance on vandalism. We're under no obligation to let this slide as a childish prank." A swirl of frustration and fear churned in my gut. "So, this has nothing to do with personal vendettas? Because I've heard rumors, Linda, about how you run this place. Some neighbors say you trample on folks just for the thrill of it." She gave a tight smirk. "You might want to check your sources. This is about preserving the integrity of Heritage Oaks. If there's any personal angle, it's your son's choice to cause chaos. If you insist on defending that, I suggest you hire a lawyer." I stood rooted there for a moment, fists clenched at my sides. There is something about the way she emphasized lawyer that grated on me. It felt like a promise of a protracted, expensive legal battle. With a final glance at the half-ruined hallway, I turned and left. A part of me felt a glimmer of doubt. Could Marshall have been involved in something so ridiculous? But deep down, I knew my kid wasn't the type to orchestrate such a massive stunt. Not alone, anyway. Outside, I squinted against the midday sun. For the first time in years, I felt like I was looking at my neighborhood through new eyes. A curated environment policed by a secretive board, more concerned with power and discipline than community spirit. It was a place I thought safe for my son. A place with wide streets and manicured lawns and families who planned summer barbecues. But now, that pristine veneer was cracking. I trudged to my car, mind buzzing with next steps. Lawyer, yes, we needed one. But beyond that, I wanted the truth. If Marshall was framed, who would do that and why? If he'd been coerced, who was behind it? And what if, just what if, the HOA was covering something bigger, some petty drama or hidden scandal? After all, the easiest scapegoat is a teenage boy already known for the occasional rebellious streak. As I started the engine, I thought about all the times I'd shrugged off the HOA. Maybe I'd overlooked too many warnings, paid too many petty fines, and let them run roughshod over our sense of freedom. Now, with my son's future on the line, I wasn't about to stand by. I pulled out of the parking lot and vowed, I'd get to the bottom of this, and I'd take on the Heritage Oaks board if that's what it took. Back at home, I found Marshall hunched at the kitchen table, staring at the swirl of milk in his cereal bowl. He barely looked up when I entered. His phone sat beside him, unopened messages piling up. My heart sank a little seeing him that way. A mix of fear, guilt, and teenage melancholy weighed on his posture like a lead blanket. I eased into the chair across from him. "We need to talk," I said quietly. He nodded, setting his spoon aside. "I'm sorry, Dad," about his voice cracked. "I promise I didn't do it, but it's my fault for not telling you everything sooner." My chest tightened. "What do you mean?" He folded his arms, glancing at me with wet eyes. "I've been hanging around people you don't know. People who, well, they don't exactly love the HOA. They call themselves the Commission. It's a dumb name, but basically they're a bunch of older teens and early 20-somethings in the neighborhood who are sick of the HOA's rules." I raised an eyebrow, baffled, but not entirely surprised. Youth often push back against authority, and the HOA was an easy target. And you got involved because Marshall sighed. At first, it was just jokes. We'd meet up on weekends, talk about how the HOA messed with someone's yard, or forced a neighbor to repaint a house that wasn't up to community standards. Some members of the commission messed around with the HOA sign once, changing it to read Heritage Oafs. They never got caught. He paused. I just go to blow off steam. I never thought it would get serious. Suddenly, the foam fiasco wasn't such a random event. So, one of them might have set you up? I ventured. Marshall nodded fervently. I think so. There's this girl, Kat, who's older, maybe 20, and she's really into like full-blown sabotage. I heard her talk about how it would be epic to fill the vents with soap, but I never believed she'd actually do it. She's the only one I know who had the cleaning chemicals and foam supply. She works part-time at a janitorial supply store. A swirl of anger, relief, and worry coursed through me. On one hand, the puzzle pieces were aligning. This cat might have orchestrated the chaos, then used Marshall as the fall guy. On the other hand, if there was evidence tying Marshall to the scene, it meant Kat or someone else had gone the extra mile to implicate him. Why didn't you tell me this right away? I asked, trying to keep my frustration in check. He shook his head. Because I was scared. I was stupid. I thought I could handle it. I thought maybe if I said nothing, it would blow over, like the old pranks. But they pinned it on me. He slumped. I was at her place that night, but we were just watching a movie, the group was there, and I stepped out early. Someone must have grabbed my hoodie, or he exhaled sharply. I'm sorry, Dad. I messed up. I reached out and gripped his shoulder. We'll figure it out, but I need you to trust me. No more secrets. He nodded, tears teetering on his lashes. I swear, no more secrets. That afternoon, I decided to do some investigating of my own. Step 1. See if there was any security footage from the surrounding streets or other angles that might show someone else wearing Marshall's trademark hoodie. Step 2. Track down this cat and see what she had to say for herself. Step 3. Talk with a lawyer who wasn't cowed by the HOA's intimidation tactics. I started by canvassing neighbors who lived near the HOA building. Most folks answered their doors with expressions that ranged from curiosity to thinly disguised fear. I recognized that fear. It was the same one that kept them from questioning or defying the HOA. A few said they'd heard a loud crashing sound around 9 p.m. Others saw a person in black clothes sprint across the parking lot. One older man, Mr. Hightower, claimed he glimpsed a second figure in the shadows, like they were waiting in a car. The puzzle was taking shape. If Marshall could prove he wasn't even on the premises, that might help. But the cops in the HOA were set on the security camera footage, grainy as it might be, that pointed to a figure resembling him in height and build. And this supposed car matching yours could be any dark sedan. Half my block drove black sedans. By evening, I was on the phone with a defense attorney recommended by a friend. She sounded competent, advising me to gather any and all evidence, including phone records, text logs, anything that showed Marshall's location that night. And get statements, she said. If there's someone else who might have done it, find them. The more you dig up, the better. I hung up, a mix of hope and trepidation fluttering in my chest. On one hand, we might clear Marshall. On the other, who knew what the HOA had up their sleeve? They had money, power, and a vested interest in making an example out of my son. Still, I was determined. I wasn't alone in this. Marshall was by my side, albeit shaken, and I had the suspicious existence of the commission. I half expected the name to be some silly teenage code for let's meet up and egg houses, but apparently they'd escalated. The more I thought about it, the more I suspected Kat might be the real culprit. Maybe it was a misguided protest against Linda's draconian rule. Or maybe there was something deeper. Around 9 p.m., I confronted Marshall in the living room. I found him scanning his phone. Are you texting her? I asked gently. He looked up, startled. Kat? Yeah, I tried. She's ignoring me. Actually, she blocked me. That set off alarm bells. If she's blocking you, it might be because she's worried you'll figure out the truth. Marshall pressed his lips together. I'm sorry about all this. I pulled him into a quick hug, murmuring, we'll handle it. We will. Yet long after he headed to bed, I sat awake in the dark silence, mind churning with fear and anger. Outside, The streetlights cast an orange glow on the well-manicured lawns, each bush trimmed to exact proportions. On the surface, it all still looked like the ideal suburban paradise. But beneath that surface, alliances were shifting, secrets were swirling, and there was a tension in the air as thick as the soap bubbles that had allegedly consumed the HOA meeting room. And I intended to pop every last bubble of mystery until my son's name was cleared. A few days later, we found ourselves back in a cramped room at the police station, this time with the defense attorney present. Her name was Cheryl Bronsky, a woman in her late 50s who wore practical pumps and had steely eyes that told you she'd seen it all. She had this no-nonsense way of speaking that somehow reassured me more than any pep talk could. She laid out the good news and the bad news in plain terms. Good news. The prosecution's case rested heavily on that grainy footage and the HOA's damage estimates. If we could undermine the reliability of the footage or show the HOA had exaggerated damages, we'd have a chance at a lesser charge, possibly even a full dismissal if we were lucky. Bad news. The HOA had money to burn, especially if Linda was leading the charge. They could hire forensic experts, digital analysts, and might even try to claim additional harm if their first argument wavered. As we wrapped up the meeting, Cheryl suggested we try to speak directly with the commission if we could track them down, especially Kat. If the real culprit confessed, the case would fold. But that was easier said than done. The commission, from what Marshall told us, operated like a loose clique rather than a formal group. They communicated mostly via ephemeral chat apps or by meeting up in obscure corners of the neighborhood after dark. Marshall and I started sleuthing. He texted a couple of the other commission members, a shy kid named Parker and a part-time college student named Dale. Both insisted they had no involvement, but neither was eager to talk to me, a parent. Eventually, Parker agreed to meet us discreetly at the skate park one Sunday afternoon. The sun beat down on the cracked concrete as skateboard wheels rattled in the background. Parker was a wiry boy with dyed green hair, probably 16 or 17, and he looked nervous as a cat in a room full of rocking chairs. "Dude, this is messed up," he told Marshall. "Kat's been bragging about sending a message to the HOA, but she never said she'd pin it on you." I folded my arms. "So she did it? Are you sure?" Parker shrugged, swallowing hard. "I wasn't there, okay? But the night it happened, Kat posted something cryptic online. Foam party at the nest. Wait for the pop." She took it down a few hours later. I saw it. Dale saw it too. Everybody's freaked out, 'cause this turned into like a huge deal. Marshall scrunched his face. "Why would she frame me?" Parker looked around nervously. "You told her your dad hated the HOA, right? Maybe she thought you'd take the fall quietly. Or maybe it's just that you're the youngest, the easiest target." We pressed him for more info, but Parker insisted that was all he knew. He handed over a screenshot of Kat's deleted post, though it was just a partial snippet. It might be something our lawyer could use. Still, it wasn't a confession. Kat was nowhere to be found. Apparently she'd vanished from the group's chat, too. I started to wonder if Linda and Kat shared a strange alliance. That seemed unlikely, but the way Linda had quickly pinned Marshall and the speed with which Kat disappeared made me suspect a deeper connection. Perhaps not a collaboration, but a chain of blackmail or intimidation. That night, I resolved to confront Linda again, privately, and see if she'd drop any clues. Her reaction to my phone call was predictably icy. "Mr. West, if this is about your son, please know the board's decision stands. We are proceeding with the charges." I pressed on. "We have reason to believe someone else was involved. If you push forward with prosecuting the wrong person, it reflects poorly on the HOA." She gave a humorless laugh. "I'm not interested in speculation." "Is it speculation if we have evidence?" I retorted. "We found a witness who can tie someone else to the actual soap purchase." She paused. "That's for the police and courts to decide, not me. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a meeting to attend." Before I could counter, she hung up. My blood simmered with frustration. It was as if Linda was intent on ignoring any alternative suspect. Or maybe she didn't believe we had anything substantial. In any case, the conversation was going nowhere. Meanwhile, the neighborhood chatter intensified. Word got out that the foam had done more than ruin carpets. It had shorted computers containing resident information, housing plans, and even financial data. Some folks whispered about how those computers might have had incriminating evidence of the HOA's misuse of funds. Others speculated the entire fiasco was orchestrated to distract from the missing money. One rumor suggested that Linda had discovered irregularities in the community budget and wanted to bury them under the fiasco. The more people gossiped, the more possibilities blossomed like noxious weeds. Caught in the crossfire was my son, who couldn't step outside without feeling accusing eyes on him. At the grocery store, an older resident glared so openly that Marshall hurried to another aisle. The tension was gnawing at him. It was gnawing at me, too. A week later, we had a small break. Cheryl, our attorney, managed to get a hold of the police's incident report. It included statements from a night janitor who claimed he heard two voices, not one, inside the building that night. The janitor's original statement to the police suggested it might have been a female voice urging the other person to pour in more soap. Yet the HOA apparently hadn't highlighted that detail when the cameras were reviewed. Either they overlooked it or they chose not to mention it. That single detail, two voices, could change everything. It supported Marshall's claim he wasn't involved, especially if the female voice belonged to Kat. But the janitor's name was redacted, presumably for privacy. We needed him to testify if we were going to show a second culprit was at the scene. Cheryl filed a motion to identify and interview the janitor. The hearing was set for the following week. Time felt like it was speeding by in a blur. Every day, I saw the weight of stress in Marshall's tired eyes. He still went to school, but he'd come home, bury himself in his room, and rummage through his phone for glimpses of Kat's whereabouts. Meanwhile, I wrestled with guilt for not paying more attention to who he spent time with. But regrets aside, I was determined to clear him. If the HOA truly was spinning this to hide something, or if Linda was trying to posture as the heroine who fought teenage vandalism, we'd force their hand in court, prove they had the wrong person, and reveal the truth. Yet some nagging voice in the back of my mind wouldn't shut up. Why was Linda so adamant about ignoring all evidence that didn't implicate Marshall? Sure, she was tough, but it felt personal. And Kat's abrupt disappearance was too suspicious. There was more to unravel here, and I feared we might be stumbling on a secret bigger than a soapy prank. Whether it was an embezzlement scheme, a personal vendetta, or both, the deeper we dug, the more we risked shaking the foundation of Heritage Oaks. I just hoped it wouldn't bury us. By the time the preliminary hearing arrived, our nerves were frazzled. Marshall sat at the defense table in a rumpled button-down shirt, anxiously twisting the hem of his tie. I sat to his left and Cheryl to his right, exuding a calm efficiency that I desperately clung to. Across the aisle sat Linda and two HOA board members, stiff as mannequins, with their own legal counsel, a smug attorney who looked like he'd stepped straight from a country club lounge. The hearing room wasn't large. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, and the walls were painted in institutional cream. The judge, a balding man in his 60s, eyed the documents in front of him. The charges were read: felony vandalism, criminal trespass, property damage. My stomach tightened at each mention, but I refused to look over at Linda. Instead, I kept my focus on Marshall's trembling hands. Cheryl was up, presenting the newly uncovered evidence. She introduced the idea that there was a second voice at the scene, as per the janitor's initial statement. She emphasized that the grainy security footage was inconclusive. No face could be seen, no license plate, and no direct link to Marshall besides the alleged silhouette. Then she dropped the bombshell. We had a witness who'd come forward claiming that a person named Kat purchased a suspicious amount of industrial soap around the time of the incident. To my shock, the HOA's lawyer tried to dismiss it as hearsay and teenage speculation. But Cheryl, prepared as always, requested a subpoena for the janitor's identity so we could interview him. The judge pursed his lips, flipping through the folder. Finally, he sighed, stating that, given the seriousness of the charges, the defense was entitled to investigate all leads. With a tap of his gavel, he granted the request and scheduled a follow-up hearing. It wasn't a victory, But it was the first sign the legal system wouldn't just rubber stamp the HOA's accusations. Outside, Linda shot me a glare that could have melted steel. I steel my own resolve. "We'll find the truth," I said pointedly, catching her eye. She didn't respond, just turned on her heel and strode off, her minions in tow. 2 days later, we learned the janitor's name, Leroy Sanchez. Tracking him down wasn't hard. He was a friendly man in his late 50s who actually lived a few blocks away in a small rental home near the neighborhood's edge. The moment we introduced ourselves at his front door, he looked nervous, like he was expecting to be harassed for violating some arcane HOA rule. But once we explained why we'd come, relief and eagerness lit his face. "I was waiting for someone to ask me," Leroy said, beckoning us inside. He led us into a modest living room. Old crocheted blankets and faint traces of lavender-scented air freshener gave the place an unassuming charm. "It ain't right that boy's getting blamed," he said, shaking his head. "I know what I heard that night." Over cups of tea, Leroy recounted how he'd been vacuuming the small office next to the meeting room around 9 p.m. when he heard laughter echo through the hall. "It was a girl, definitely," he said. "She was giggling, telling somebody else to keep pouring. That's when I poked my head out, but the lights were off in the hallway. Next thing I know, the alarm starts blaring. I panicked and hid in the supply closet. By the time I came out, the foam was everywhere, and the folks were gone. It was chaos." Marshall leaned forward. "You're sure there were 2 voices?" Leroy nodded. 100%. The other voice was deeper, but I can't say if it was your voice or not, kid. I only heard a few words before the alarm drowned everything out. It was more than enough to suggest Linda's certainty was misplaced, assuming it was just Marshall. More telling was Leroy's story of how the HOA's attorney had interviewed him the day after, then seemingly decided his testimony was not helpful. Leroy said he never heard from the police, which was bizarre. The HOA must have provided a selective or skewed summary. After finishing our meeting, Leroy agreed to testify if subpoenaed. I felt a surge of gratitude. At last, we had a living witness who could confirm the presence of someone else, a female voice, right there in the building. I called Cheryl from my car, my words tumbling over themselves in excitement. She was cautiously optimistic. This could blow their case wide open, provided Leroy's testimony holds up and they can't discredit him. But I also knew we needed more to definitively point the finger at Kat. The same day, Parker texted Marshall saying he'd convinced Dale to share the screenshots from Kat's phone, photos she'd allegedly snapped of the foam disaster before leaving. If we could tie the timestamp and location data to her, that would be the smoking gun. My heart hammered as we waited for Parker to send them over. By midnight, the images came through. They showed the HOA meeting room covered in mountains of white foam, time-stamped around 9:15 p.m. on the night of the incident. The phone's metadata was partially stripped, but we could see the partial geolocation reading matched the Heritage Oaks building. The name Kat's iPhone topped the original file properties. It was a bombshell piece of evidence. A swirl of emotions hit me. Relief that we were close to proving Marshall's innocence, outrage that Kat had run off, and a burning curiosity about Linda's angle in all this. Perhaps Linda had latched onto Marshall simply because he was an easy culprit, or maybe she knew Kat was responsible but saw a chance to push an agenda. Either way, we were armed and ready for the next hearing. When the day of the hearing arrived, Linda and her entourage wore matching, determined frowns. Their lawyer's bravado had cooled. Cheryl presented Leroy's testimony calmly, methodically. Leroy confirmed he heard a female voice urging the foam to be poured. Then, Cheryl presented the phone images, complete with the timestamp. She explained how they'd come from Kat's device, someone else entirely. The judge's eyes flicked toward the HOA's counsel. We all held our breath. The HOA's lawyer tried to pivot, claiming they'd only press charges based on the security footage. But the judge wasn't swayed. He glared at them, pointing out how Leroy's statement should have been part of the evidence from start. "It appears you selectively omitted crucial testimony," the judge said. "Ms. Fitzsimmons, I trust you have an explanation?" Linda stood slowly, her face drawn. "We were simply following procedure, Your Honor," she insisted, her voice quavering ever so slightly. We believe the footage was conclusive. The judge didn't let her off easily. Conclusive? In light of this new evidence, I'm inclined to believe Mr. West's son may have been misidentified or set up. Unless the prosecution can provide a clearer link, I'm dismissing the charges. I felt Marshall's hand grip mine under the table. A weight melted off my shoulders. Within moments, the gavel dropped again. Case dismissed. Outside the courthouse, Linda brushed past me, her jaw clenched. I noticed a flicker of shame cross her features. Whether she was just embarrassed or truly remorseful, I couldn't say. She muttered something about filing an appeal, but it sounded hollow. Legally, they had no standing. The board members shuffled behind her, avoiding eye contact. Marshall exhaled like he'd been holding his breath for days. I gave him a reassuring squeeze on the shoulder. "It's over, bud," I murmured. As we headed to the parking lot, a sense of elation swelled in me, and a determination that this entire ordeal wouldn't simply vanish. Because while the charges against Marshall were dropped, I doubted Linda would give up her crusade. And there was the matter of Kat, who had apparently fled or gone into hiding. Whether she'd ever face consequences or come clean, I wasn't sure. Yet for now, we had our victory. My kid was free. The fiasco had pulled back the curtain on the HOA's flawed tactics, exposing how easily an overzealous board and a single-minded chairperson could nearly ruin a family's life. Neighbors reached out to congratulate us, some telling their own stories of intimidation and pettiness. A few even hinted at organizing to demand transparency in the HOA's finances and procedures. An unexpected unity began blossoming in the community as people questioned the status quo. Standing at the threshold of my home that afternoon, I paused to take it all in. The house looked the same. The trimmed hedge, the newly painted mailbox, still that silly, soft midnight gray. But something had shifted in me. I realized the power an HOA can wield, especially one run by individuals more interested in control than actual community well-being. The bubble foam fiasco might have erupted as a misguided prank, but it had ignited something bigger, a spark of resistance, a wave of questions about fairness and integrity. "Dad," Marshall said, his voice subdued, "thanks for believing me." I turned and hugged him tight. "Always." We stepped inside, letting the door close on the swirl of suspicion and drama that had engulfed our lives. Tomorrow, I'd look into ways we could reform the HOA or at least hold them accountable. But tonight was for breathing freely again. I thought of the foam that had covered that meeting room. Once a menacing sea of trouble, now a memory that left behind a clean slate. It was a lesson learned the hard way. In neighborhoods as in life, you can polish your lawns and paint your mailboxes, but real integrity means more than following a checklist of rules. And if ever those in power forget that, it only takes one determined parent and maybe a few suspicious bubbles to remind them that not everything can be neatly controlled. The end.